Welcome to another great video by Quiet Mind, Happy Heart. In this video, we're going to have Native American stories for sleep. We're going to have American Indian tales and stories of spirituality, myths, legends, and mythology. So please get comfortable and let's get started. Leelinau, the Lost Daughter. Leelinau was the favorite daughter of a hunter who lived on the lake shore near the base of the lofty highlands called Wunzh. From her earliest youth, she was observed to be shy and thoughtful. She spent most of her time in solitude and always seemed to prefer the companionship of her own shadow to the society of the lodge circle. Whenever she could leave her father's lodge, she would fly to remote haunts and recesses in the woods, or sit in lonely thought upon some high promontory of rock overlooking the lake. In such places she would often linger, with her face turned upwards in contemplation of the air, as if she were invoking her guardian spirits and asking them to lighten her sadness. But of all the leafy haunts, her favorite was a pine forest on the open shore called Manitowok, or the Sacred Wood. It was one of those holy places which is the resort of the wild people of the woods, and of the turtle spirits and fairies which delight in romantic scenes. Because of all this, it was seldom visited by many Native Americans because they feared falling under the influence of its mischievous inhabitants. And whenever they had to land on this part of the coast because of bad weather, they always left an offering of tobacco or some other token to show that they thought of the favor of the dwellers of the fairy ground. Leelinau had made her way to this sacred spot at an early age, gathering strange flowers and plants, which she would bring home to her parents and then tell them of all the things that had happened while she was out walking. Although they disapproved of her frequent visits to the place, they didn't stop her because she was so gentle, and they didn't want to thwart her. Therefore, her attachment to the fairy wood increased as she grew in years. If she wanted to commune with her spirits to have pleasant dreams, or for any other small favor, Leelinau went to the Manitowok. If her father remained out in the woods later than usual, and it was feared that he had been overwhelmed by a beast or the weather, Leelinau offered up her prayers for safety at the Manitowok, and it was there that she fasted, walked, and contemplated her life. After some time she became so engrossed by the fairy pines that her parents began to suspect that some evil spirit had enticed her there and had cast a charm upon her which she didn't have the power to resist. This belief was confirmed when one day her mother, who had secretly followed her, overheard Leelinau murmuring some words like these to an unknown and invisible companion. "Spirit of the dancing leaves," whispered Leelinau, hear a throbbing heart in its sadness. Spirit of the foaming stream, visit my nightly pillow, shedding over it silver dreams of mountain brook and pebbly rivulet. Spirit of the starry night, lead my footsteps to the blushing violet, or where the burning passion flower shines with brilliant hue. Then turning with passionate gaze to the beautiful young pines, which stood waving their green beauty over her head, she said, Spirit of the greenwood plume, shed on me, on Leelinau the sad, your leafy fragrance, like the spring unfolds from sweetest flowers, or hearts that to each other show their inmost grief. Spirits, hear, oh hear my prayer. Day by day these strange communications with unseen beings drew the heart of Leelinau more and more away from the simple duties of the lodge and her family, and she walked among her people melancholy and silent, like a spirit who was visiting from another land. The pastimes which engaged the frivolous moments of her young friends passed her by as trivialities in which she had no concern. When the girls of the neighboring lodges assembled to play their favorite game of Papa-iko-wan, or the block and string before the lodge door, Leelinau would simply sit vacantly by, or enter feebly into the spirit of the game to demonstrate that it was of no interest to her. Again in the evening, when the young people formed a ring around the lodge, and the piidonjijung, or leather and bone, passed rapidly from one to the other, she handed it along without attempting to play, and with no effort to succeed. The time for gathering corn had come, and the young people of the tribe were assembled in the field, busy in plucking the ripened maize. One of the girls, noted for her beauty, had found a red ear of corn, and everyone congratulated her because it was a sign that a brave admirer was on his way to her father's lodge. The girl blushed and, hiding the trophy in her bosom, thanked the Great Spirit that it was a red ear and not a crooked one that she had found. Then it so happened that one of the young men saw in the hands of Leelinau, who had plucked it, a crooked ear of corn, and at once the word Wajimen was shouted aloud through the field, and the whole circle of people erupted in a roar. "The thief is in the cornfield," exclaimed the young man Iago, who was famous in the tribe for his entertaining powers of storytelling. "Don't you see the old man stooping as he enters the field? Don't you see the signs that he crouched as he crept in the dark? Isn't it plain by this mark on the stalk that his back was heavily bent? You'd better be nimble, old man, or someone will take you while you are collecting corn." Iago said all of these things as he stooped over with the action of a person bowed over with age, and he stealthily entered the cornfield and continued. See how he stoops as he breaks off the ear. Nushka! He seems for a moment to tremble. Walkers, you'd better be quick. It's plain the old man is stealing our corn. Then Iago turned suddenly to where Leelinau sat in the circle, pensively regarding the crooked ear which she held in her hand. Iago then exclaimed, Leelinau, the old man is yours. Laughter rang loudly throughout the cornfield, but Leelinau threw the crooked ear of corn down on the ground and walked away from the others. The next morning the eldest son of a neighboring chief came to her father's lodge. He was quite advanced in years, but he was renowned in battle, and his name was also famous in hunting and gathering, so the parents accepted him as a suitor for their daughter. They hoped that his good qualities would draw Leelinau back from the spirit land, where she seemed to have wholly directed her affections. It was the chief's son whom Iago had indeed pictured as he told the group his story, but without objecting to his age or giving any other reason, Leelinau firmly declined her suitor's proposal. The parents put their young daughter's hesitancy down to the fears of youth, and without paying any attention whatsoever to her refusal, a day was set for her suitor for a marriage visit to the lodge. But when the elder warrior came to the lodge door, Leelinau refused to see him, informing her parents again that she would never consent to marry him. It had been her custom to spend many of her hours in her favorite place, under a broadly topped young pine tree, whose leaves whispered in every wind that blew. But most of all, she enjoyed the gentle murmur of the air at the evening hour when twilight begins to fall. She went to that great wood now, and while reclining in thought against the young pine tree, she thought she heard a voice talking to her. At first it was scarcely more than a sigh, but then it grew clearer, and she heard it distinctly whisper, "O beautiful youth, think of me not as a tree, but as your own dear lover, who is glad to be with you in my tall and blooming strength, with the bright green dancing plume that waves above you. You are leaning on my breast, Leelinau. Lean forever here and be at peace. Fly from those who are false and cruel, and quit the tumult of their dusty strife for this lonely shade. I will fling my fair arms over you, fairer than your home. I will breathe a perfume of flowers over your happy evening rest. In my canoe of bark, I will carry you over the waters of the sky, of the lake blue sky, I will deck the folds of your cloak with the sun's last rays. Come with me, and on the mountain you will be free to rove as a bright fairy with me." Leelinau eagerly drank in these magical words. She was determined and resolute. No elder warrior would clasp her hand. She listened in the hope of hearing the voice once more, but it only repeated, "Again, again," and then it ceased entirely. On the day of the evening that her parents had set for her marriage, Leelinau dressed in her best garments. She then styled her hair and put on all of her beautiful jewelry. With a smile, she presented herself to her parents. She said, "I am going to meet my lover, the chieftain of the green plume, who's waiting for me at my spirit grove." Her face was radiant with joy, and her parents, taking what she had said as her own colorful metaphor for expressing her agreement to their marriage plans, wished her good luck in her happy meeting. "I am going," she continued, addressing her mother as she left the lodge. "I am going from one who has watched my infancy and guarded my youth, who has given me medicine when I was sick and prepared my food when I was well. I am going from a father who has ranged the forest for my welfare and kept his lodge supplied with food. I am going from a lodge that has been my shelter from the storms of winter and my shield from the heats of summer. Farewell, my parents, farewell." And having said this, she sped to the edge of the fairy wood, and in a moment she could no longer be seen. After she had left the lodge, her parents weren't afraid, but confidently waited for her to return. But hours passed, and as the clouds of evening rolled up in the west, the darkness came on, and their daughter did not return. They then went into the wood with torches, and although they lit up every dark recess of the fields, their search was in vain. Leelinau was nowhere to be seen. They called her name aloud in lament, but she didn't answer. Suns rose and set, but the bereaved parents never again saw the lost form of their beloved daughter. Their child was lost indeed. No one knew exactly what her fate had been, although it just so happened that some people who were near the spirit grove described something that seemed to resemble a female figure standing on the shore. Since the evening was mild and the waters calm, they cautiously pulled their canoe toward land, but the slight ripple of their oars created alarm. The figure fled quickly, but they could recognize in the shape and dress, as she ascended the bank, the lost daughter, and they saw the green plumes of her fairy lover waving over his forehead as he glided lightly through the forest of young pines. Wunzh, the father of Indian corn. Sometime in the past, although we can't tell exactly how many years ago, a poor Native American man was living with his wife and children in a beautiful part of the country. He not only was poor, but he had the misfortune of being a very poor hunter and gatherer, and he couldn't get enough food for his family since his children were all too young to give him any assistance. Although of a lowly condition and constrained by his circumstances, he was a man of a kind and contented disposition. He was always thankful to the Great Spirit for everything he received. He even stood in the door of his lodge to bless the birds that flew past in the summer evenings. The same gracious and sweet disposition was inherited by his eldest son, who was now of the proper age to undertake the ceremony of the fast, to learn what kind of spirit would be his guide and guardian through life. The son's name was Wunzh, and he had been an obedient boy from his infancy, very pensive, thoughtful, and gentle, and he was much loved by the whole family. As soon as the first buds of spring appeared and the delicious fragrance of the young year began to sweeten the air, his father, with the help of his younger brothers, built for Wunzh the customary little lodge at a spot some distance from their own, where he wouldn't be disturbed during his solemn rite. To prepare himself, Wunzh sought to clear his heart of every evil thought and to think of nothing except that which was good and beautiful and kindly. In order to have pleasant thoughts in his mind for his dreams, he amused himself during the first few days by walking in the woods and over the mountains, examining the early plants and flowers. As he rambled far and wide through the wild country, he felt a strong desire to know how the plants and herbs and berries grew without any aid from human beings, and why it was that some of them were good to eat and others had medicinal or poisonous powers. After he had become too exhausted to walk any farther, he confined himself to the lodge and recalled these thoughts, and turning them over in his mind, he wished he could dream of something that would prove to be a benefit to his father and his family, and to all others of his fellow creatures. It is true, thought Wunzh, that the Great Spirit made all things, and it is to the Spirit that we owe our lives. But couldn't the Spirit make it easier for us to get our food? I must try to find this out in my visions. On the third day, Wunzh became weak and faint and stayed in bed. Suddenly, as he lay there, he thought he saw a bright light come in at the lodge door, and a handsome young man with a complexion of the softest and purest white coming down from the sky and advancing toward him. The beautiful stranger was richly dressed, having on many garments that were green and yellow in color, but differing in their deeper or lighter shades. The young stranger had a plume of feathers on his head, and all of his motions were graceful. He reminded Wunzh of the deep green of the summer grass and the clear amber of the summer sunset sky and the gentle blowing of the summer wind. The stranger was beautiful, and he paused on a mound of earth just in front of the door of the lodge. The celestial visitor said, "I am sent to you, my friend. I am sent to you by the Great Spirit who makes all things in the sky and on the earth. He has seen you and knows your motives in fasting. He sees that it is from a kind and benevolent wish to do good to your people and to your creatures and to procure a benefit for them, that you do not seek for strength in war or the praise of people from battle. I am sent to instruct you and to show you how you can do good for your family." He then told the young man to arise and to prepare to wrestle with him, since this was the only means by which Wunzh could hope to succeed in gaining his wishes. Wunzh knew how weak he was from fasting, but the voice of the stranger was cheery, and it put so much courage in his heart that he promptly sprang up, determined to die rather than fail in his mission. Wunzh began the trial, and after a long sustained struggle, he was almost overpowered. Then the beautiful stranger said, "My friend, that is enough for now. I will come to wrestle you again." And smiling, the stranger returned through the air in the same direction from which he had come. The next day, although Wunzh saw how sweetly the wild flowers bloomed upon the slopes, he longed to see the celestial visitor and to hear his voice again. To his great joy, the beautiful stranger reappeared at the same hour as before, just as the sun was going down, and he challenged Wunzh to another trial of strength. The brave Wunzh felt that his strength of body was even less than the day before, but the courage of his mind seemed greater. Observing this, and how Wunzh put his whole heart into the struggle, the stranger spoke to him again. "Tomorrow will be your last trial. Be strong, my friend, for this is the only way that you will overcome me and obtain what you seek." And the light that shone after him as he left Wunzh was even brighter than before. On the third day the stranger came again. Poor Wunzh was very faint and weak in body, but he was stronger in heart than ever, and determined to win now or die. Wunzh put forward his very best and strongest effort, and after a contest more severe than either of the others, the stranger declared himself conquered. For the first time the stranger entered Wunzh's little fasting lodge and sat down beside the young man. He then began to deliver instructions to him on how to go forward to take advantage of his victory. The beautiful stranger said, "You have won your desire of the Great Spirit. You have wrestled skillfully. Tomorrow will be the 7th day of your fasting. Your father will give you food to strengthen you, and since it is the last day of your trial, you will prevail. I know this, and now tell you what you must do to benefit your family and your people. Tomorrow," he repeated, "I shall meet you and wrestle with you for the last time. As soon as you have won, you will strip off my garments and throw me down. Then clean the earth of roots and weeds and make it soft, and bury me in that very spot. When you have done this, leave my body in the earth and do not disturb it, but come from time to time to visit the place, to see whether I have come to life. And above all, be careful never to let the grass or weeds grow upon my grave. Once a month, cover me with fresh earth. If you follow these my instructions, you will accomplish your object of doing good to your fellow creatures by teaching them the knowledge I teach you now." He then shook Wunzh by the hand and disappeared, but he was gone so soon that Wunzh couldn't tell what direction he had taken. In the morning, Wunzh's father came to his lodge with some light refreshments and said, "My son, you have fasted long enough. If the Great Spirit will favor you, he will do it now. It is 7 days since you have tasted food, and you must not sacrifice your life. The Master of Life does not require that." Wunzh replied, "My father, wait until the sun goes down. I have a special reason for extending my fast to that hour." "Very well," said the old man. "I shall wait till the hour arrives, and you shall be inclined to eat." At his usual hour of appearing, the beautiful sky visitor returned, and the trial of strength ensued. Although he hadn't eaten the food his father had brought him, Wunzh felt a new strength. His heart was strong because he wanted to achieve his great purpose. Courage with the bosom of the brave Wunzh was like the eagle that spreads his wings on the treetop for a great flight. He grasped his angel challenger with supernatural strength, threw him down, and mindful of the instructions he had been given, tore off his beautiful garments and plume, and immediately buried him on the spot, using all the precautions he'd been told about. And Wunzh was very confident the entire time that his friend would come back to life again. Wunzh then returned to his father's lodge, and he was warmly welcomed, for, as it had been appointed to him during the days of his fasting to walk apart with heaven, he was not permitted to see any human face except that of his father, the representative of the little household upon the earth of the Great Spirit who is in heaven. Wunzh ate only a little of the meal that had been prepared for him, and once more took part in the cares and concerns of family life. But he never for a moment forgot about the grave of his friend. He visited it carefully throughout the spring and weeded out the grass, and kept the ground soft and pliant. And sometimes when brave Wunzh thought of his friend that was gone from his sight, he dropped a tear on the earth where his friend lay. Watching and tending and moistening the earth with his tears, it wasn't long before Wunzh saw the tops of green plumes coming through the ground, and the more faithful he was in obeying his instructions in keeping the ground in order and in cherishing the memory of his departed friend, the faster the green plumes grew. He was, however, careful to conceal all of this from his father. Days and weeks passed in this way, and the summer was drawing to a close, when one day, after a long absence in hunting and gathering, Wunzh invited his father to follow him to the quiet and lonesome spot of his former fast. The little fasting lodge had been removed, and the weeds kept from growing on the circle where it had stood. But in its place were tall and graceful plants, topped with dancing plumes and stately leaves and golden clusters. There was an aspect in the bearing of these plants, the deep green of the summer grass, the clear amber of the summer sunset sky, and the gentle blowing of the summer wind. "It is my friend," shouted Wunzh. "It is the friend of all humankind. It is Modawin. It is corn to eat. We no longer have to rely on hunting, because as long as this gift is cherished and taken care of, the ground itself will give us food." He then pulled an ear of corn from one of the plants. He said, "Look, look, my father, this is what I fasted for. The Great Spirit listened to my voice and has sent us something new to eat, and from now on our people will not have to depend on hunting or fishing." Wunzh then told his father the instructions that had been given to him by the friendly stranger. He told him the broad husks must be torn away, as he had pulled off his friend's garments while wrestling, and, having done this, he directed him how the ear must be held at the fire until the outer skin became brown, just as the complexion of his angel friend had been tinted by the sun. With this, all the moistness was retained in the beautiful golden grain. The whole family, in high spirits and deeply grateful to the Great Spirit who had given them this abundant food, enjoyed a great feast on the newly grown ears of corn. This is how the mighty blessing of that healthful grain came into the world, and we all owe those beautiful kernels of corn to the dream of Wunzh, the brave boy who communicated with the Great Spirit. How Wasbashas the Snail Became a Man, or the Origin of the Osage Tribe. Upon the banks of the Missouri River there once lived a snail in great enjoyment, for he found plenty of food, and was never in want of anything that a snail could need. After some time, however, disaster reached him. The water of the river overflowed its banks, and although the little creature clung to a log with all his strength, hoping to remain safe upon the shore, the rising flood carried both him and the log away, and they floated helplessly for many days until the waters subsided, when the poor snail was left upon a strange shore that was covered with slime from the river. And there, as the sun rose, the heat was so intense that he was irrevocably fixed in the mud. Oppressed with the heat and drought, and famished from lack of nourishment, in despair he resigned himself to his fate and prepared to die. But suddenly new feelings arose, and a renewed vigor came to him. His shell burst open, his head gradually arose above the ground, his lower extremities divided into fingers, and thus beneath the influence of the shining sun, he became a tall and noble-looking man. For a while he was stupefied by the change. He had no energy, no distinct thoughts, but gradually his brain resumed its activity, and he became determined to travel back to his native shore. Naked, ignorant, and almost perishing with hunger, he walked along. He saw creatures that he could have eaten, but he remained hungry. He finally became so weak that he laid himself on the ground in despair, thinking that he was certainly going to die. He hadn't been lying there for very long when he heard a voice calling him by name. Wasbashas! He looked up, and before him beheld the Great Spirit sitting upon a white animal. And the eyes of the spirit were like stars, the hair of his head shone like the sun. Trembling from head to foot, Wasbashas bowed his head. He couldn't look at the Great Spirit. Again the voice spoke in a mild tone. Wasbashas, why are you so terrified? I tremble, replied Wasbashas, because I stand before him who raised me from the ground. I am faint. I've eaten nothing since I arose from a little shell upon the shore. The Great Spirit then lifted up his hands, holding a bow and arrows in them, and telling Wasbashas to look at him, he put an arrow to the string of the bow and sent it into the air. When a deer then came into sight, he placed another arrow to the string and let it fly. These are your arms, said the Great Spirit, handing him the bow and arrows. You are naked, said the Spirit, and you need to be clothed. For although we had to sacrifice these blessed animals, it was done for your warmth and protection. The skies will now change and bring rains and snow and cold winds. Having said this, the Great Spirit also built a fire. He then placed a string of wampum around his neck. Then the Great Spirit said, This string of wampum is your reminder that our beloved creatures may only be sacrificed when needed. Having done this, the Great Spirit arose in the air and vanished from sight. Wasbashas refreshed himself with the food, and afterward traveled on to his native land. Having walked a long distance, he seated himself on the banks of a river, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that the Great Spirit had said. Then a beaver came up from the water and addressed him. "Who are you?" said the Beaver, "and why have you come here to disturb me?" "I am a man," Wasbashas replied, "but I was once a creeping shell." "Who are you?" "I am king of the nation of beavers," was the answer. "I lead everyone in my kingdom up and down this stream, and the river is my dominion." "I must divide it with you," said Wasbashas. "I have promised the Great Spirit to protect the beasts and birds, fishes and fowls, and he has provided me with everything I need for your protection and mine." And then Wasbashas showed him the gifts he had received from the Great Spirit. "Come, come now," said the Beaver in a modified tone. "In truth, we are brothers. Walk with me to my lodge and refresh yourself after your journey." So, saying this, he took Wasbashas, who had accepted the invitation with great eagerness, to a beautiful large villa where he was entertained in the chief's lodge, which was built in a cone shape, and as the floor was covered with pine mats, Wasbashas thought it had a very delightful appearance. After they were seated, the chief asked his wife and daughter to prepare for them the choicest food in their possession. Meanwhile, the King Beaver entertained Wasbashas by informing him about how they constructed their lodges, and described their manner of cutting down trees with their teeth, and placing them across streams so as to dam up the water, and also instructed him in the method of finishing the dams with leaves and clay. In this wise conversation, the chief cleverly passed the time and also gained the respect of Wasbashas. His wife and daughter now came in, bringing in fresh peeled poplar and willow and sassafras and elder bark, which was the choicest food known to them. Wasbashas politely pretended to sample these offerings, while his entertainer devoured a large amount with great enjoyment. The daughter of the tribe now attracted the eyes of Wasbashas. Her modest deportment, neat attire, and dedicated attention to the commands of her father heightened very much to Wasbashas her charms, which in his estimation were very great. And the longer Wasbashas gazed upon the daughter, the more deeply he became enamored of her, until he finally decided to ask her to marry him. He then spoke persuasively to the chief, begging him to allow the union. The chief gladly agreed to this, and since the daughter also had formed a favorable opinion of her suitor, the marriage took place, but not without a feast to which beavers and friendly animals were all invited. And from this union of the snail and the beaver, the Osage tribe has its origin.